All right, Alexander, let's do an update on Ukraine, and let's start things off with a quick update what is going on the ground, and then we can move over to the Munich Security Conference, which is taking place from the 17th up until the 19th. And Lukashenko is also in Moscow, in Russia as well, meeting with Putin. And we had some interesting comments from Victoria Nuland in an interview she gave with the Carnegie Endowment, and whatever else we need to talk about. But let's just do a quick update as to what's going on the ground, because we have a lot of different viewpoints as to what is happening in Ukraine. A lot of stories about ammo running out. But then you have statements like that of Ben Wallace, which is that 97% of the Russian military is in Ukraine at the moment, and 40% of the Russian military has pretty much been wiped out. So you're getting all kinds of different stories as to what is happening on the ground in Ukraine with the Russian military. But the last I've seen is that we've got one cauldron and perhaps another bigger cauldron happening in Bakhmut.
Absolutely, this is exactly right. I mean, the reality is, I'm not going to spend much time on Ben Wallace's latest fantasies. Let's focus on the actual military situation. I mean, Bakhmut is clear is becoming an emerging cauldron, because a couple of days ago, there were reports, which I discussed on my channel, that Ukrainians might be preparing to withdraw from Bakhmut. They blew up the bridge. There was talk that they'd withdrawn some of their heavy equipment from Bakhmut. There was some talk that they'd left a rear guard behind. It looked as if they were withdrawing from Bakhmut. Well, if that was the decision, it's been reversed, because they've just, again, apparently sent more people there. At the same time, they've lost control of one critically important village north of Bakhmut. This is Krasnaya Gora, which is on high ground. And they're in the process today of losing a second one. And this is a slightly bigger place called Paraskovyevka. Now, Paraskovyevka is very close to these big roads that we've been talking about. There's only one that the Ukrainians can still use to transport men and supplies into Bakhmut. But the more important thing about Paraskovyevka is that if it falls, then the way starts to open up for the Russians to push further west towards a town called Chasov Yar. They've approached Chasov Yar from the south. If they push also towards Chasov Yar from the north, then we're talking about a very big cauldron indeed in and around Bakhmut. So already it seems the Ukrainian troops in Paraskovyevka are effectively surrounded, and there's apparently thousands of them there. They were troops that withdrew from Solidar have been relocated to Paraskovyevka, but the access points to Paraskovyevka are being closed. Latest reports suggest that the Russians are now in control of the northern part of this particular village. The Ukrainians are still trying to hold out, but it looks like Paraskovyevka is going to be lost, and the Russians, once they capture Paraskovyevka, as I said, they're going to close the pincers. They're going to move towards closing the pincers around Bakhmut by pushing further south towards Chasov Yar, which they're already approaching from a different direction. So that seems to be the battle that's going on. Now, this is a long, grueling battle. I thought the Ukrainians might pull back. Zelensky, again, has apparently intervened. They got to hold out there to the very last man. The foreign minister, a man called Kuleba, who's an extreme hardliner, also says that they've got to hold out in Bakhmut. And, of course, the fact that Zelensky is now again talking to the West, he's addressing the Munich Security Conference, we'll come to all of that. He doesn't want to be seen retreating, losing ground, and that's why he's doing it. And there's also news further north, a place called Kremenaya, which is on the border between Lugansk region and Kharkiv region. Very, very tough fighting going on there as well. And the reports suggest, there's reports which are suggesting that Ukrainian losses in this area are now rising to match the losses that they're experiencing in Bakhmut. So very, very tough fighting indeed. Now I'm going to just say a few things about Ben Wallace. 97% of the Russian army is supposedly in Ukraine. Well, self-evidently, that isn't true. I mean, there's these hundreds of thousands of Russian reservists have been called up. We've talked about this many times, that they've been located in and around Ukraine. They're not 97% of them in Ukraine. There's a large Russian grouping piling up in Belarus as well. But these are new forces, and as we've discussed in the past, they've not yet been committed to the battle. We've been seeing a lot of fighting going on in Ukraine over the last few weeks, but these fresh troops have not been committed to that battle yet. And Ben Wallace talks about, these Russian army having been devastated. He ought to consult the BBC, because the BBC every so often does an open access survey of Russian losses in Russia, together with a website called Medusa, which is a very strongly anti-Putin Russian website based in Latvia. I mean, they trawl through social media, they trawl through newspapers, they check all the registries, they check all the cemeteries. And what they found is that the total confirmed losses that the Russian military has suffered in Ukraine since the very start of the fighting a year ago up to 12th of February, they can only find records confirming 12,000 people killed. 14,000 people killed. Now that's a lot of people killed, but it doesn't come anywhere close to matching the kind of numbers that people like Ben Wallace are coming up with. So, these figures from the BBC are confirmed, concrete numbers. They are, by the way, they track very closely the numbers provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense. They don't in any way correspond with the kind of numbers that Ben Wallace is coming up with, which seem to be based on, bad intelligence, bad information coming from Ukraine, things that really make no sense at all.
Yeah, but I agree. Bad intelligence from Ukraine, bad intelligence from UK intel services. But, Ben Wallace, he may not be a genius, but you would imagine that even he would be able to understand that 97% of the Russian army is not in Ukraine and 40% of the Russian army has not been destroyed. But he comes out and he tells that to everybody.
Yes.
He comes out to an interview and says, this is what's going on. And so my question for you is why? Why is he saying these things when you would think either he does believe it and he's an idiot, or he knows that's not the truth, but he's repeating this claim that he's getting from somewhere or from someone. And it's not only Ben Wallace. You're getting reports from various publications, Collective West publications, from Financial Times to Bloomberg. They're all pretty much saying the same thing. There is no ammo, there are no tanks, there are no fighter jets, and even if there was ammo, tanks, and fighter jets, the situation would still not improve for Ukraine. They're finally coming out and admitting it, but yet we are getting statements from Ben Wallace, like what you just talked about. We're getting statements from Victoria Nuland, who gave an interview yesterday. She said the goal of Ukraine, what Zelensky is working on right now, is taking the territories of Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and then we're going to focus in on Crimea, and then we're gonna look at some sort of regime change in Russia. We would prefer the Russians to rise up and overthrow Putin. She said that just yesterday. Blinken said that the Zelensky regime, what we're working on right now, he said, is once again Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, a big spring offensive. but I'm going to put a stop to Crimea. I'm gonna tell them not to go all the way to Crimea, and it goes on and on and on. As long as it takes. Ukraine's going to win. Mark Milley said that there's no way Russia can win. I'm just trying to understand.
No,
where is the disconnect when someone is saying there's no more ammo. Look in your warehouse. Look, it's empty. There's nothing left to give. But yet these officials are coming out and they're just making wild statements about the eventual victory of Ukraine. How is this going to happen? How is this spring offensive that Lloyd Austin was talking about 2 days ago and Stoltenberg was talking about 2 days ago? How is this going to happen when you don't have the fighters, the fighter jets, the tanks, the ammo, all of these things to match Russia? How are you going to take back Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea, like they're telling us they're going to get these territories back? That's what Nuland said. We're going to get all of these territories back. Milley pretty much said the same thing. Blinken the same thing. What is happening here? What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, what is clearly going on is that there is behind the scenes a huge row going on. And when I say row, I don't mean that the people are shouting at each other, but there is some kind of a debate going on. And you see people staking out positions. So the realists, and they are realists, are coming along and saying, look, we can't sustain this war. This is impossible. It doesn't make any kind of sense. We talked a few weeks ago about sending 88 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. We've only been able to come up with 18. The Germans have come up with 14. The Portuguese might provide another 4. Perhaps later in the year, Poland might come up with some, 30 more very old Leopard 2s, which need a lot of refurbishment. But, we're not able to give Ukraine the 88 Leopard 2s that he was talking about. So we're going to give Leopard 1s instead, but that might also take a very long time. We're out of ammo. You said that. We've discussed that at length. I mean, there really isn't much more to say. There's no way they can increase ammo production to anything like the levels that Ukraine is demanding. They're not going to provide fighter jets. They're not going to provide other sorts of equipment. So we have 100 Bradleys, 40 Marders, and that's about it. Now, given that this is so, we're starting to see pressure from all sides, from all sorts of sides. Scholz was talking about this at the Munich Security Conference. He was basically hinting he's now getting worried. He wants to see some kind of a negotiation take place. We've had the Republicans, the anti-war Republicans in Congress getting increasingly organised. There's been a very strong speech from Josh Hawley. I mean, saying, we're overcommitted. This doesn't make any kind of sense. We can't be strong everywhere. We're depleting our arsenals in Europe. Our real adversary is China. Why, when I first voted to send money to Ukraine, I didn't expect it would be an indefinite proxy war. But the hardliners, the neocons, this is their project. They can't pull back on it, because if they do, and neocons, obviously their central place is Washington, so that's people like Nuland, Blinken, Robert Kagan, those sort of people. Their focus is in Washington, but they do exist elsewhere. Ben Wallace has been dragged in for the ride. He's a very close ally of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson wants to be Prime Minister again. He's acolytes in London and making that very clear. They can't pull back, because if they pull back in Ukraine, if they accept that this war in Ukraine is lost, we're going to see this as the end of their great project. Break up Russia, engineer regime change in Moscow. It's all going to fail. In fact, today, as I'm talking to you, there's an article in The Guardian by another neocon, Simon Tisdall, my old friend. He goes on and says, people like Liz Truss, the former British foreign minister, talking about China. This is a mistake. We should be focusing instead on Ukraine, on Russia. China is too powerful for the moment. We've got to pick off the Russians first. So they want to keep this war going. They want to launch this offensive. There may not be enough tanks. There may not be enough infantry fighting vehicles. But you've got to keep up the magical thinking that this war is going to somehow turn out right. So you bring up, as another journalist in the British media did today, you remember we talked about the Russian budget deficit in January. He's created a whole article around this fact that, this is proof that Russia's about to implode economically. So you see, that's what they want to do. They want to keep the war going. And they're saying, look, things might not be going too well for the moment in Ukraine, but just hold on a little longer. We'll launch another offensive. We'll throw more tanks and more machines at the Russians. They've got 97% of their army in Ukraine. They've lost 40% of it. Something will crack. And, they're keeping their fingers crossed and hoping for that to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, the whole point of being a neocon disappears. Because if you can't take out Russia, if you can't take out Putin, if you can't achieve regime change there, the whole neocon project goes up in smoke.
Yeah. The neocons are going to definitely focus on China after Ukraine. Let's just say their goal is to focus on China after Russia and Ukraine, but they have to deal with Russia and Ukraine first. For some reason, the neocons can't just skip over Russia, Ukraine, and go to China. They have to deal with Russia and Ukraine first. I don't know. Maybe it's some sort of neocon checklist, or I don't know. Maybe that's like the terms and conditions when you sign up to be a neocon. This is the path you have to follow, but they have to deal with Russia and Ukraine, and nothing else matters at this point in time. So we do have the Munich security conference taking place. At the same time, we have Lukashenko meeting with Putin. It seems like it's business as usual between Russia and Belarus. But in Munich, what are we going to see in Munich? Because last year it was an S show, because you had Kamala Harris there, you had Ursula there, Olaf Scholz was there, and you had a suit and tie, Zelensky running around Munich, and he was talking about nukes. We're getting nukes. We deserve nukes. It's part of what was it, the Budapest Memorandum?
That's right.
Was that the memorandum with that they always cite? This is proof. This is proof that we deserve nukes because of this memorandum, which I think we've debunked like many 10 times in our videos. But many times. But that was last year, and that was kind of the final straw for Russia to green light the special military operation. Zelensky running around saying he's going to get nukes, and no one in the West stopping him from running around and saying these things. No one told him to shut up, which I thought was interesting. But this year, what are we to expect this year? Because we pretty much have the same diplomats.
Oh, yeah. It's all the same people. It's all the same people.
Yeah.
It's all the same people. Yeah, just before we go to Munich, I mean, just to explain about neocons and neocon thinking and why they are so, fixated on Russia. Some of them may have historical grievances towards Russia, that arise from their family histories. But always remember the two great foundational texts of modern neoconism was Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard and this paper, this memo that was written by Paul Wolfowitz right at the start of the George W. Bush administration. And Brzezinski talked about, fragmenting and controlling Russia, and that way you'd control the globe and, put pressure on China. And Wolfowitz said that the central objective of US policy must be to prevent a challenge emerging against the United States from Eurasia. And of course, he was talking about Russia again. So these are their foundational texts. These are their gospels. And it's very difficult for them to break away from this. That's why they come back always to Russia. Why? Yes, of course, they want to come after China eventually, but they can't bring themselves to do that unless this unfinished business they have with Russia is finally resolved to their satisfaction. So that's the thing to always understand about the neocons. Russia first. It's always the way with them. They will never change that, and they will resist any attempt from someone like Josh Hawley, for example, to drag them away from this and to get them to start thinking about other things, like China, for example. But anyway, let's go back to Munich. Munich last year was a circus of people who'd got themselves high in expectation that there was going to be a war. The war was going to end very fast. They'd have all the great sanctions that they were going to impose. Russia was going to collapse. All the restraints had been cast off. All these realists who'd been holding them back, they'd all finally gone. Obama, who had his, occasional doubts, he'd gone. Trump had gone. All of those people had gone. So now we were going to be able to go ahead, all guns blazing, and we were going to do it. And I remember I was watching and reading the speeches coming out of the Munich Security Conference. And this was the moment when I said to myself, my goodness, we might actually be in a war. Up to this point, I thought we might be able to avoid a war. But listening to the sort of way these people were talking was what made me think that, war might actually be coming. This year it's different because all of those confident predictions have not happened. We've not had Russia collapse economically. We still hope it will happen, but it actually so far hasn't happened. And the IMF is talking about growth. And we have not won any great military victory over the Russians. We were hoping there would be a knockout blow, that the Russians would hit their heads, bang their heads against the wall. We'd built all these defenses in eastern Ukraine. Didn't work out. We launched those offensives in Kharkov and Kherson, and they didn't create the crisis and panic in Moscow that we expected. And we're losing ground in Bakhmut, and all sorts of things are going wrong instead. So it's a much, much more somber mood this time. And, of course, Zelensky is there. He's out with his begging bowl. He wants every conceivable weapon system that you can find. He wants the taboo on Western weapon supplies to Kiev to be extinguished. I mean, what taboo he's talking about, I have absolutely no idea. He says that Ukraine is David to Russia's Goliath, but it lacks the sling. It lacks David's sling, which is an interesting metaphor, by the way. But, that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about nuclear weapons this time, by the way, but which he did last time, as you correctly said. But, this time he's not talking about that. But everything he says is predictable. All of the others, they're also talking. So far, the mood seems to be much more somber. And the keynote speech so far has been by our old sleepy friend, Olaf Scholz. He says, yes, we're going to supply Ukraine with all kinds of weapons, but the most important thing is to avoid a conflict between Russia and NATO, and we need to try and find some means to de-escalate. So you don't need to take that especially seriously. I don't, but it's very different from the kind of rhetoric we were getting last year.
Is that a sign that there are certain people like Olaf Scholz and maybe Nord Stream has had that effect on him, where they are saying this is enough? Not only is this enough, but these neocons are kind of maniacs, and a guy like myself, Olaf, I'm kind of in over my head. Do you think that may be at play, or not yet? They still need some time to get there.
I think they still need some time to get there, and I think that there is a debate going on. As I said, I mean, I don't. Row is too strong a word, but there is a debate going on, and this is why we're getting all these, extraordinary claims from people like Ben Wallace about the Russian army is 40% degraded and that kind of thing. So we're getting all. There is a debate. That debate is principally happening not in Munich or in Berlin or in Brussels or in London. It's happening in Washington. There's an article today in The Guardian about, a worried article. Is the Republican right, people like Hawley, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, are they a real risk to continued funding for Ukraine? I don't believe that, by the way. I think that the pro-war coalition in Congress is still overwhelmingly strong. I mean, Mitch McConnell is still committed to giving Ukraine and the administration all the money it needs to wage the war. But I think the other force that's now, becoming increasingly dominant, that's starting to get its points across through the media. You talked about the articles in the Financial Times, in Bloomberg, in all sorts of places, about the Daily Telegraph, also Politico, about the fact we just don't have the weapons to give Ukraine. I think the militaries across NATO are starting to assert themselves. So no ATACMS missiles from Ukraine, not because we're really afraid that providing these missiles to Ukraine will cause an escalation crisis, but we just don't have enough. The Patriot systems, do you remember we're hearing lots and lots about those? Well, they're not appearing till 2024. We're going to try and produce apparently a few missiles between then and now. Tanks, well, 88 tanks. Ukraine was supposed to get Leopard 2s. They're only going to get 18. We're out of shells. The British Air Force isn't going to part with any of its fighters. Ben Wallace himself had to admit that a few days ago. Didn't like to do it, but he was forced to. So this is the real obstacle the neocons and their friends are running up against. And we've had the RAND Corporation saying a prolonged war isn't in our interest. And we've had the CSIS saying we're running out, our stocks are becoming depleted. We've had the people from the production side. There's an article by Dr. Jack Watley from the Royal United Services Institute in the Telegraph saying we can't just increase shell production tomorrow. I mean, it doesn't work like that. And that's what the neocons are up against. So, of course, what they're going to try and do, and we're going to see that in Munich, even as the sort of voices of restraint, people like Scholz, probably Scholz is very upset about Nord Stream. I think he's even more upset about the tank issue. He didn't want to send the tanks to Ukraine, not because, again, he's got any particular concerns about the Russians. He knows that the military just doesn't have that many tanks. He's also apparently not on speaking terms any longer with Baerbock, because apparently she's been saying cracking jokes at his expense. All of that is coming together, and you can start to see that the lines are the lines are starting to form. And the danger is, what the neocons are going to do is they're going to tell Ukraine, look, we're up against the clock. Sometime around the summer, support is going to run its course. You've got to achieve some kind of breakthrough over the next few weeks and months. By midsummer, you've got to take the offensive. The neocons have never worried too much about the practical realities of things. So they want Ukraine to launch its attack on recover all of Donbass, recover all of Kherson region, recover all of Zaporozhye. They want that offensive to happen, and Ukraine is going to be pushed into an offensive it's simply not really prepared for.
Yeah, an offensive with what? That's
With
my
what? Yeah.
That was my point from the beginning of the video. An offensive with what? CNN is reporting that Ukraine is burning through ammunition faster than the US and NATO can produce it inside the Pentagon's plan to close the gap. And they're talking about how the Pentagon is now ramping up the production of ammunition for Ukraine, and they're going to be moving to a 24/7 schedule to keep pace with Russia. It's not that simple. I just can't bring myself around to believe that it's just as simple as flipping on a switch and all of a sudden the U.S. is now in a war economy for Ukraine. It doesn't add up, and everything that I'm hearing is confusing me, because you're getting all these different, like we were talking about, you're getting all these different statements and all of these claims about Russia's weak, Russia is losing, we're gonna win, but we don't have ammo, we don't have tanks, we don't have fighter jets, but the hope strategy is going to prevail. I think even Seymour Hersh said in an interview that the Biden White House is relying on magic to win the conflict in Ukraine. I think that's the word he used, magic, magic victory in Ukraine. And then I'm seeing the reality, which is that the physical reality is it's not there. The equipment, the ammo, the troops, it's not there, while Russia has conserved all of their troops, and they've got the ammo. They've been producing the tanks and the ammo for so long. So my point is that the Pentagon, I believe, some people, the Pentagon, put a timeline for this to be around the summertime. This is what they said about a month ago. They said, we expect the war to conclude around the summer. That was their timeline, that they kind of fixed to this conflict. I think that's what's coming around. I mean, it seems like this is what's going to happen. Is this summer timeline, and the goal right now from the War Hawks is exactly as you said. Is there any way that we can magically create some sort of victory from now until then? And maybe then we'll be able to extend this summer deadline from the military and then push it to the winter, because it seems like the military, or parts of the military, have said, we're giving you until the summer. That's it. Yes.
I mean, I think you're exactly right. In fact, I suspect that there's been discussions. I mean, a few weeks ago, the naval chiefs in the US were saying, we got about 6 months, which correlates with the summer. That, after 6 months, the United States needs to make a decision. Does it go on supporting Ukraine, or does it look after itself? And that was from the Navy. And remember, the Navy is ultimately, the core, the Navy and the Air Force are the core of the US military system. And I would argue the Navy's ultimately the more important of the two. So, that's the Navy speaking. And I think this is probably right, that they say, up to the summer, you don't achieve your breakthrough by then frankly, you've got to seek peace, even if it's on Russia's terms. So that's why we see all this frenetic activity, why there's talk about, more offensives, why there's talk about getting Zelensky to launch his latest attack, and talking about, the magical thinking, 40% Russian military destroyed, Russia about to run out of this, that, and the other. I mean, it's always been proved wrong. But anyway, that's what it's all about. It's keeping your fingers crossed, hoping that somehow Ukraine will pull it together, get some kind of breakthrough in Zaporozhye, in Kharkiv, in wherever it is, and then we'll be able to do that which we always have sought to do, achieve regime change in Russia, and make good on our grand plan. It's probably going to be a very dangerous couple of months, because, of course, if it goes right, which I don't expect, well, it'll be a crisis. But if it goes wrong, it could be a bigger crisis, because I don't believe that these people will simply go away. I think what they will do, if it goes wrong, is that they will push back. They will try nonetheless to get that timeline extended. And I suspect that the row, which is already happening, this argument this debate that's already happening will finally burst out into the open.
All right. Any other final thoughts before we wrap this up?
I mean, just look at the mood change. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, they were it was triumphalism. They were deliriously optimistic about the way things were going, and the fact that there's been this change of mood tells you that, when they talk about spring offensives, and people like Austin talking about and Milley talking about spring offensives, the military doesn't really believe in them, but the neocons absolutely do. And I have to tell you, I can't help but think that if there's a crisis by midsummer, where they're going to try and push not just for some more support for Ukraine, but more direct support from the Western powers for Ukraine. In other words, Polish troops going in, American pilots operating F-16s, that sort of thing. So I still think this is going to be a big row, but the danger of that kind of escalation might actually grow.
Yeah, I agree with you, but at this point, I believe that there's no escalation that the West can do outside of a full-on invasion of NATO into Russia, into Ukraine. There's no escalation that the Russians can't match and exceed.
Yeah, I know.
Whether it's NATO pilots flying the F-16s or Polish troops entering.
Yeah. We come back to what Obama, of all people, said. He did sometimes get things right in that interview with The Atlantic that he gave back in 2016, that at all times the Russians in Ukraine have escalatory dominance. Whatever we do, because it's their neighborhood, they can not only match it, they can surpass it. So if we send in tanks, they'll send in more tanks. If we send in our troops, they'll send in more of their own. If we send in aircraft and fighter jets, they'll shoot them down. And we can never ultimately prevail in this kind of conflict. And talking about sending, Western forces to take on the Russians, it's a really interesting article that I read a short time ago. And it's been circulating in private. Apparently, I've only seen bits of it. But it pointed out how unrealistic ultimately it is for the West to take on Russia, even in conventional terms in this war, that it required 1 million troops, 1 million men from, all the various branches of the NATO military to defeat Saddam Hussein's army in Iraq in 1991. And against the Russians today, that simply isn't going to happen. We don't have those 1 million men, and nobody's going to really take on that kind of risk against the Russians. So, but, that is the risk we're running. I mean, that's what these people might want to do, because if the neocons know, if they lose in Ukraine, the core project is lost. Of course, they won't go away. They'll still press on for more conflicts in the Middle East, against Iran, against China, wherever they can. But no one any longer will see the neocons as the future.
Yeah. TheDuran.locals.com. We are also on Rockfin as well. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOOD DAY. Take care.